to start off with, we're going to use a soft bristled flat brush, and we're going to apply a thin layer of your paint that you received in the box. So that's going to be the pop-up color Ecru. You're just going to want to apply a thin layer to it. It doesn't need to be thick. Just make sure you have a flat, even thin layer with no streaks, and then don't forget the bottom of that too. I don't prep my tumblers, but you're more than welcome to, before you start this step, sand and prep your tumbler as you normally do, and then paint on your first layer. Once that's done, we're going to let it dry for about 10 to 15 minutes, just enough to where it's dried to the touch, and then we're going to apply a second layer of paint directly over that. This layer we're going to apply a bit more of a thick layer. You want it completely covered, and you want to work quick during this step. You're going to use the same flat, soft bristled brush, apply your second layer of paint, a nice thick layer, and then you're going to apply the glitter directly over to this wet paint. Once you've got your tumbler fully coated with your glitter, again, don't forget the bottom, you're going to let this dry for about another 10-15 minutes, and then you can spray it with a clear coat spray. I use the Mod Podge clear coat spray, the gloss, and that's what works best for me. After we've sprayed our tumbler with the clear coat and let that sit for at least 24 hours, now we're going to mix up 15 milliliters each part A and B epoxy. For this step, I'm using the medium viscosity. I find that the thinner consistency of this is easier for the first coat, as it helps not to move the glitter around as much. So I'm just using a gloved hand here, and I'm lightly applying it over the entire tumbler. Don't forget the bottom, and make sure you cover the entire thing. You don't want any dry spots, as this will cause problems down the line. So once you've fully covered your tumbler, now we're going to take your second glitter, the chunky glitter, and we're going to lightly sprinkle this over the bottom half of the tumbler, working our way up to the top. For this step, I prefer using my bare hand instead of the glove. I just find that it's easier to get more control this way, but you can use whichever method works for you. If you want to put it into a shaker and sprinkle it on that way, that's an option too. So I'm just going to start at the bottom, lightly sprinkle it on, and then once I work my way up towards the top, I'm just going to use a little bit less so that there's just a tiny amount going up on the top of the tumbler. Once you're happy with the looks, we're just going to simply let this cure for the 24 hours on your turner. Once you've let that cure for the 24 hours, you're going to go over it again with another coat of epoxy, and then let that cure for the 24 hours again as well. To make our topper, we're going to start by mixing up 5 milliliters epoxy. I am using Fast Set for mine here, but you can use medium viscosity, you can use artist resin, or whichever epoxy you prefer. So we're going to mix up our epoxy, and then we're going to add in our nice and thick 1 scoop at a time until you find that it's the desired consistency. If you're using Fast Set, it really doesn't take much, and for this step here, you don't need it to be super thick, so a couple of scoops should do just fine. Once you have it to your consistency you like, you're going to add in 1 to 2 drops of the alcohol ink, and then 1 small little drop of the butterscotch dispersion color. You're going to mix that up really well, make sure that the ink and the dispersion color are fully blended in, and then we're just simply going to apply this over the top of our base topper. Since we added the nice and thick to make this more of a thicker epoxy, we shouldn't have to worry too much about the epoxy dripping over the edge of your topper. If it does, that's totally fine. It's easy enough to clean up off the edges once it's cured. The only thing that you really want to make sure is that you don't get it into the straw hole, because that's a little bit harder to clean up. Once you have it over the top of your, fully covered over the top of the topper, you're going to just lightly spritz it with alcohol to pop any of those bubbles. Now we're just going to take the apples and then arrange them on the topper. Just make sure that you leave enough room for the straw to still go through that straw hole. Using the same epoxy that we just mixed up, you're going to lightly drizzle it over the tops of the apples. The thicker that you make your epoxy, the more that it's going to cover here. So depending on the coverage that you're looking for, if you made it a little bit thicker, you'll have more covered apples. If you made it a little less thicker, it's going to run more, causing it to look more of like a drip, and then some of that apple will still show through versus it being fully covered. When you're applying the epoxy to the apples here, just be mindful that the apples are not secured yet. They can still move around, so if they move out of place, just lightly push them back into place so that straw hole is still accessible. So now we're just going to sprinkle on the little fake peanuts that were included. You can sprinkle them on directly to the apples. I find personally that I think they're a little bit too big for these size apples, so I like to just sprinkle them or place them directly on the topper. You can use a pair of tweezers to kind of place them exactly where you're looking for in this step here. This step here is an alternative method that you can use as well for the apples that gives it a different look. So in this step here, you'll see my apples are already epoxied to my topper, so I don't have to worry about them moving around. In this step, I'm actually applying the epoxy directly over the entire apple versus the previous method, I was just using it to kind of drip around the apple, leaving some of that apple still showing through. This way it's going to give it a fully covered look, so it looks like it's an actual dipped caramel apple. You can try out both methods to see whichever works best for you. I personally prefer this method here. I find that the fully covered apple looks better in my opinion, but it's really entirely up to you on which step you want to take for this part. Once you have your apples fully covered the way that you'd like, you're just going to let that cure for the 24 hours. Once your second layer of epoxy on your tumbler has cured, we're going to apply the water slide. So I've given you two choices. You can choose whichever water slide you like, or you can even go with a completely different one. The way that I apply mine is I'm going to trim it to the shape, so I want as little of the excess on there as possible. And then I use a spray bottle to get mine completely wet, but you can also dip it in like a small little pot of water too, or even just run it under the sink, whichever is easiest for you. Once you've got it completely wet, you want to make sure there's no dry spots. You're going to stick it to the tumbler, make sure that it's completely flat on your tumbler. Then you're going to hold it by the top with two hands and then simply slide that paper backing out from behind it. So once you have it lined up and even on your tumbler, you're just going to use a cloth. I like using the microfiber towels because it doesn't leave any of that lint behind. So you're just going to get all the wrinkles out, smooth it out, and then make sure that you don't have any water under there as well. If you find that your water slide isn't vibrant enough, you can always go ahead and add a second layer of water slide directly over the first to make it appear more vibrant too. Once you've let your water slide sit for about 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to mix up 10 milliliters each part A and B epoxy, and then we're going to apply that over the tumbler. You'll see in the video here, I did not let my second layer of water slide sit long enough, so it did start to move around slightly. I was able to fix it by just readjusting and removing any of those wrinkles that were in the water slide, and then still continue to apply my epoxy directly over it. Once you've got your tumbler fully coated with the epoxy, including the bottom, don't forget the bottom and the edges especially, you'll just want to let that sit for the 24 hours to cure.